Last time, we left Malloy watching the water boil. 3 hours for the cakes. She had time. She wasn't in a hurry anymore. Jack had promised to call Thu to work out a solution that would help everyone. But promises and phone calls are one thing. Actually sitting down, actually talking through the numbers, actually making a deal that changes everything, that's something else entirely. And the question was, what happens when they finally meet? 2 days later, Jack drove to meet Thu. Not at her house, not at his office. They met at a small cafe halfway between. Neutral ground. The kind of place where business happens quietly. Thu was already there when he arrived. She had papers spread out on the table. Documents, maps, land survey results. "Thank you for meeting me," Jack said. She nodded, looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. "I brought everything," she said. "All the documentation, the full picture." Jack sat down, ordered coffee he probably wouldn't drink. Then he looked at the papers. The land plots were in Ninh Binh province. 5 plots total, different sizes. Thu had bought them 3 years ago, using Meloy's investment as part of the capital. The plan had been simple: wait for development in the area, then sell at a profit. But development was slow. The market had cooled. And now Thu needed to sell quickly to pay Meloy back. "This one," Jack said, pointing to the second largest plot. "This is the one I'm interested in." Thu leaned forward. "For your project?" "Yes, the location works. It's close enough to the tourism area, but far enough to keep costs manageable. I can use it for worker housing during construction, maybe convert it later. And you can pay market value," Jack said. "Not what you hope to get, what it's actually worth right now." Thu's face fell slightly. Jack kept his voice steady. "I had someone evaluate all 5 plots. Here's what they're worth in today's market." He slid a paper across the table. Thu looked at the numbers. Her hands were shaking slightly. This is less than I paid." "I know, the market changed, but this is realistic. This is what you'll actually get if you sell now." She was quiet for a long moment. "If I sell you this plot at this price," she said slowly, "I can pay back about 60% of what I owe your mother." 60% is better than 0%, Jack said gently. "And you'll still have 4 other plots. You can hold them. Wait for the market to improve. Sell them later when prices are better." "But your mother?" "My mother knows the situation," Jack said. "I talked to her. She understands. She's not looking to punish you. She just needs some capital back. Enough to feel secure again." Thu covered her face with her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "We've been friends since we were children," she whispered. "I never wanted this to happen." "I know," Jack said. "My mother knows that too." Outside the cafe window, people walked past. Normal day, normal life. Inside, a deal was taking shape that would change everything. Thu pulled out a tissue, dabbed at her eyes. "You're very kind," she said. "Like your mother. She raised you well." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just waited. "When I first got involved in that land deal," Thu continued, "I thought I was being smart, investing wisely, building something for my future." She laughed, but it was a sad sound. "I told your mother it was safe. I believed it was safe. I wasn't trying to trick her. I really thought—" "I know," Jack said again. Thu folded the tissue in her hands, over and over, a nervous habit. "How is she?" she asked quietly. "Your mother? Really? Not what she says? How is she?" Jack thought about that. About Loi waking up at dawn to make cakes. About her sitting alone in the kitchen, worried. About her hiding her stress so he wouldn't feel burdened. "She's okay," he said. She worries. But she's strong. She always was, Thu said. Even when we were girls. She was always the strong one. They sat in silence for a moment. The coffee was getting cold. Thu looked down at the papers again, at the plot Jack wanted to buy, at the numbers that were lower than she'd hoped, but higher than nothing. Okay, she said softly. Let's do it. Let's make this work. Jack felt something release in his chest. Tension he didn't know he'd been carrying. This wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything. But it was something. It was progress. It was a way forward. But here's what neither of them knew. While Jack and Thu were sitting in that cafe, working out numbers and signing papers, something else was happening back at the house. Mother Loi had finished her morning cakes, sold them at the market, come home with an empty basket and a quiet heart. And Tu Tien had done something she'd never done before. Something small, something that most people wouldn't even notice. But Mother Loi noticed, and it changed everything. When Mother Loi came home, Tu Tien was in the garden. Nothing unusual about that. Tu Tien often worked in the garden while Jack was away. But today was different. Today, the entire vegetable patch had been weeded. Every row, every plant. The tomatoes were tied up properly. The bitter greens trimmed. The herbs organized. And in the corner, where they usually just piled scraps, Tu Tien had started a proper compost bin. Wood frame, mesh sides, organized layers. Mother Loi stood at the gate, staring. Tu Tien looked up, saw her, smiled nervously. I hope this is okay, she said. I saw a video about composting. I thought it might help with the garden. Mother Loi walked closer. The work was careful, thoughtful, not rushed, not just trying to help, actually improving things. This is... Mother Loi's voice caught. This is very good. Tu Tien stood up, brushing dirt off her hands. I also picked some vegetables for dinner, she said. And I was thinking, maybe I could try making those cakes you make? The ones with mung beans? You could teach me? There it was. Not asking to help. Asking to learn. Asking to be part of this. Part of the family. Part of the tradition. Mother Loi felt her throat tighten. She'd been so focused on the money, on what she'd lost, on what she couldn't give Jack for his future. But here was Tu Tien, asking for something that had nothing to do with money. Asking to learn how to make cakes. Asking to become part of the small, simple rhythms of this house. Yes, Mother Loi said. Yes, I'll teach you. Tu Tien's face lit up. Really? Really? Tomorrow morning, we'll make them together. They walked into the house together. Mother Loi showed Tu Tien where she kept the sticky rice, the banana leaves, the small beans. And while they were talking about measurements and boiling times, Mother Loi realized something. She'd been worried about giving Jack capital, but maybe what she'd actually given him was something better. A woman who wanted to learn, who wanted to belong. Who cared about small things like compost bins and vegetable gardens? Maybe that was worth more than any land deal. When Jack came home that evening, he found them in the kitchen. Mother Loi and Tu Tien, sitting at the table, notebooks open. Tu Tien writing down recipes in careful handwriting. What's this? He asked. I'm teaching Tu Tien to make cakes, Mother Loi said. We start tomorrow. Jack looked at Tu Tien. She was smiling. That quiet smile she got when she was happy, but trying not to show it too much. He sat down with them. I have good news, he said. Jack pulled out his phone, opened the photos he'd taken at the cafe, the contract, the land documents, the payment schedule. I met with Thu today, he said. We worked it out. Mother Loi set down her pen. Tu Tien closed her notebook. They both looked at him, waiting. I'm buying one of the land plots, Jack said, for the Ninh Binh project, and Thu is paying you back 60% of your capital starting next week. Silence. Loi didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, hands folded on the table. Jack watched her face, trying to read her expression. Was she relieved? Disappointed? Angry that it wasn't the full amount? Finally, she spoke. 60%, she said quietly. Yes, the market value dropped, but 60% now is better than waiting years for maybe 100%. And Thu keeps the other plots. When the market improves, she'll sell those and pay you the rest. So I'll get it all back? Eventually? Eventually, Jack said. But no guarantees on timing. Loi nodded slowly. And you? She asked. This land you're buying, it's good for your project? Yes, I wouldn't buy it otherwise. This helps me too. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a sad laugh, not a bitter laugh, a real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep. What? Jack asked. I was so worried, she said. For months, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, all that worry. Mum, and now it's done. It's settled. 60% back. You get land for your project. Thu doesn't lose everything. Everyone moves forward. She shook her head, still smiling. All that worry, and the solution was so simple. Jack reached across the table, took her hand. It wasn't simple, Mom. It took time. It took work. But yes, it's done. Tu Tien was watching them both. Her eyes were bright. This is good news, she said softly. This is very good news. Loi turned to her. You know what this means? She asked. Tu Tien shook her head. It means I can stop worrying about the past. It means I can focus on the future. She glanced at Jack, then back at Tu Tien. It means I can focus on what matters. The kitchen felt different suddenly. Lighter. Like someone had opened a window and let fresh air in. Jack stood up. I should call Thu. Let her know I told you. She was nervous about how you'd react. Tell her I'm grateful, Loi said. Tell her I know she tried her best. Tell her our friendship isn't damaged. Jack nodded, stepped outside to make the call. Loi and Tu Tien sat together in the kitchen. Tomorrow, Loi said, we'll start early. The sticky rice needs to soak overnight. So tonight, before bed, we'll prepare it. I'll help, Tu Tien said. Good. Because if you're going to be part of this family, you need to know how to make proper cakes. If you're going to be part of this family, Tu Tien's breath caught. Loi just smiled, stood up, started pulling out bowls, like she'd said something completely ordinary. That night, after dinner, Loi and Tu Tien sat on the floor in the kitchen, a large bowl between them, sticky rice, water. Loi showed Tu Tien how to rinse it, how to feel for the right texture, how to know when the water ran clear enough. My mother taught me this, Loi said, when I was about your age, maybe younger. Did you like it, learning to make cakes? Loi thought about that. I liked spending time with her. The cakes were just what we did while we talked. Tu Tien nodded, rinsed the rice carefully. I never learned things like this from my mother, she said quietly. She died when I was young. Loi's hands stilled. I'm sorry, she said. It's okay. It was a long time ago, but I always wondered what it would be like to have someone teach me. Small things, kitchen things. Loi reached over, adjusted Tu Tien's hands on the bowl, showed her the right angle for pouring off the water. Well, she said, now you're learning. They worked in silence for a while, the sticky rice gradually becoming cleaner, the water running clearer. Outside, Jack was still on the phone with Thu. his voice a low murmur through the window. Inside, two women sat on a kitchen floor, teaching and learning, building something that had nothing to do with land deals or capital or business projects. Building something simpler, building family. When the rice was finally ready, Mother Loi covered the bowl, set it aside to soak. "Tomorrow," she said, "we boil." Tu Tien smiled. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. But while Mother Loi and Tu Tien were soaking rice and building bridges, Jack was having a different conversation. He'd finished talking to Thu, reassured her, told her everything was okay. Now he was sitting outside, alone in the dark, thinking. The land deal was done. The money situation was resolved. His mother would get 60% back immediately, the rest eventually. Everything was settling, which meant there was nothing stopping him anymore. No excuses, no wait until things are stable, no let me handle this first. He pulled out his phone, looked at a photo he'd saved weeks ago. A ring. Simple, elegant, the kind Tu Tien would like. He'd been waiting for the right moment. Maybe the right moment was now. The next morning, everything was different. Not in obvious ways. The house looked the same. The routine was the same. But something had shifted. Mother Loi woke up at dawn. But she wasn't alone in the kitchen. Tu Tien was already there, heating water, setting out the banana leaves. "You're early," Mother Loi said. "I couldn't sleep." Too excited. They worked together, Mother Loi showing each step, Tu Tien watching carefully, taking notes mentally. How to fold the banana leaves, how much rice, how much mung bean filling, how tight to tie them. "Not too tight," Mother Loi said. "The rice expands when it cooks. If you tie too tight, the leaves will split." Tu Tien adjusted, tried again, better. By the time Jack woke up, they had 20 cakes wrapped, ready to boil. He stood in the doorway, watching them. His mother and his girlfriend, working side by side, laughing at something. Tu Tien had banana leaf bits in her hair. Mother Loi had flour on her cheek. They looked happy. When was the last time his mother looked this relaxed? "Good morning," he said. They both looked up. "We're making cakes," Tu Tien said. Like this was the most exciting thing in the world. "I see that." Mother Loi wiped her hands. "Sit down. I'll make you tea." "No, I'll make it. You two keep working." He made tea for all three of them, brought it to the table. They took a break, sat together, drank tea while the cakes boiled. "Mom," Jack said carefully, "I was thinking about the future." Mother Loi looked at him over her cup. "What about it? About what comes next, for all of us?" Tu Tien was very quiet suddenly. Jack took a breath. This wasn't the grand moment he'd planned. No fancy restaurant, no prepared speech, just the three of them. In the kitchen, with cakes boiling and tea cooling and morning light coming through the window. But maybe that was better. Maybe that was perfect. "Mom," he said, "how would you feel about this family getting bigger?" Mother Loi set down her teacup, looked at Jack, then at Tu Tien, then back at Jack. A smile spread across her face. Slow, warm, like sunrise. "I think," she said, "that this family is exactly the right size for one more person."